Russia's long-term military strategy is destined to fail. That's the latest message from geopolitical strategist and expert Peter Zeihan. Vladimir Putin's power in Russia largely comes from his control over the intelligence services, which combines fear and deep surveillance. This approach keeps his government stable, but it's also quite fragile. History shows that Russian leaders often seem secure until they suddenly aren't. For example, just before major revolutions, everything looked calm, but something drastic happened that quickly triggered a collapse. A major loss or public humiliation could be the tipping point for Putin's government. In the past, defeats like the Crimean War weakened the Russian Tsars, and the October Revolution led to the downfall of the Russian monarchy during World War I. Similarly, the Cuban Missile Crisis led to the fall of Khrushchev. These events show that when the Russian population suddenly realizes they've been misled, the government can fall rapidly. However, even a loss in Crimea might not be enough to trigger this collapse. In a recent interview with Peter Zeihan, a political strategist and geopolitical expert, we delve into the reality of Russia's fragility and Ukraine's struggles. He points out that Russia has not yet fully mobilized its population for the war, mainly using troops from poorer, minority regions. Despite losing many soldiers, Russia still has millions of men it could draft. However, Zeihan warns that this is likely Russia's last major conflict, as its younger population is too small to sustain another war. A question remains: is this development truly beneficial for Ukraine? Make sure to stick around to the end of the video, where we will break down Peter's analysis. Also guys, only a small percentage of my viewers are subscribed. If you enjoy economics, geopolitics, and history, consider subscribing. It's free and you can always change your mind. Now, let's jump in with Peter Zeihan.
Because Putin specifically rules through the intelligence services, which is a combination of rule of terror and rule of infiltration, it's probably pretty stable. It's just that it's pretty brittle. So the Russian government, Putin specifically, is not vulnerable until the day that they are. Looking back along the stretch of history, if you look at the year before every coup or revolution, there was no reason to think anything was wrong. It all boils up very quickly, but you have to have a mass trigger. So, for example, the loss in the Crimean War damaged the Tsars. The loss in the October Revolution triggered the withdrawal from World War I and the collapse of the Tsarist system. The Cuban Missile Crisis led to the fall of Khrushchev. You have to have that very short, sharp, painful realization that Russia has lost and lost big, and then the underlying population that has been buying into the propaganda realize it's all wrong, and then the government turns. We're not there yet. I don't think the fall of Crimea even would be enough to do that. But that is really the only thing that's on the short-term horizon that would even maybe fall into that category. Yes, you'd have to have a mass defeat. So for example, if the Ukrainians were able to not simply cut that rail line, those rail lines going into Crimea, but actually advance to the coast, so that Crimea becomes basically a death camp run by Russians where Russians are dying and starving. Because remember, the Russians destroyed the Kakhovka Dam. There's no more irrigation for agriculture in Crimea at all. So all the food is imported. If you turn that into a very public, globally aware place where the Russians are dying in the streets because they can't get food in, maybe. I can't comment about Avdiivka or Bakhmut. Those numbers are just too squirrely. I don't want to say that they're wrong. I think they're in the right realm. As for the 500,000 number, I think that's absolutely accurate. Keep in mind, the Russians had 8 million men in their 20s, or at least that's what they started the war with. If they've lost 500,000 now, and 1 million have fled, that still leaves them with 6.5 million bodies to throw at this problem. And to be perfectly blunt, the Russians have yet to fully mobilize. Most of the people that they've brought in through their draft system have been minorities from ethnically disadvantaged, economically disadvantaged areas. They haven't really gotten into the core of what the country is capable of. That's still ahead of us. But at this rate, there's no way the Russians can keep this up for another 8 years. And I know that sounds like a long time. It is. But remember two things. Number one, the Russians never fight short wars. They do short intimidations. Their wars are always long because they're always about human waves. Number two, if they do this, this is their last war because there aren't enough Russians under age 20 to theoretically repopulate the system. So when this is done one way or another, Russia is done. If the Ukrainians can achieve, even just for brief moments, local air superiority, capacities of the Ukrainian military to launch offensives changes. Every offensive that the Ukrainians have attempted for the last 12 months has bogged down because they don't have air superiority. And if they can't maneuver functionally with armor and armored vehicles, then they can't move nearly as quickly. They can't move in large number, and it makes it a lot easier for Russian artillery to pick them apart. Well, if you can achieve even just for a few hours a certain blanket, then the tables turn and the Ukrainians can do things like clear mines without having to get shot at from artillery. And you throw a Patriot into that, you throw the new F-16s into that, you combine that with a little bit more liberal restrictions on the Ukrainians' ability to target objects within Russia proper, and you're seeing the Ukrainians already starting to use things like the ATACMS to prep, say, Crimea, by basically taking out something like an S-400 air defense system a day for the last week. And the Russians only have 50 of those for their entire country. So we're changing the shape of the battlefield very quickly. You plug a Patriot into that process, and we can actually have perhaps a meaningful counteroffensive this summer.
The situation regarding Russia's military capacity is increasingly dire. Despite reports on various figures, it's confirmed that Russia started with around 8 million men in their 20s. They've lost about 500,000 soldiers, with another million fleeing the country. This leaves Russia with around 6.5 million potential recruits. However, the draft has mainly pulled from economically and ethnically disadvantaged regions, not yet tapping into the core of the population. Russia might struggle to maintain its military efforts if the war continues due to these stretched resources. Historically, Russian wars tend to be long and drawn out, relying on massive waves of manpower. If the current conflict drags on, it could be Russia's last major war because the younger generation needs to replenish the military, which is insufficient. This ongoing war could significantly deplete Russia's resources, leading to severe long-term consequences for the country. For Ukraine, achieving air superiority, even briefly, could dramatically alter the war's dynamics. Ukrainian offensives have been hampered by a lack of air control, which restricts their mobility and effectiveness. If Ukraine can secure the skies, they can maneuver more effectively, clear minefields, and launch more successful offensives. Recent improvements in Ukraine's military capabilities, such as new Patriot missiles and F-16 fighter jets, combined with successful strikes against Russian S-400 air defense systems, could shake the battlefield balance. The Ukrainians are targeting these defenses to weaken Russia's air capabilities, and if this continues, it might lead to a more decisive counteroffensive. The coming summer could be critical, with the potential for significant changes in the conflict if Ukraine can exploit these opportunities effectively. Now, here's Peter Zeihan on how this summer will affect the state of the ongoing war between Russia and Ukraine.
Well, the S-400s have always been a bit of a mystery from the American and the NATO point of view, because until you're in a hot war, you have no idea how well the top-of-the-line equipment is going to work. Well, the S-400 is supposedly, pre-war, the most sophisticated anti-missile and anti-aircraft weapon system on the planet, much better supposedly than what the Americans could do. And now we discover it can't deal with rockets. So not only is this taking the Russians down several pegs in terms of their own feeling of their invulnerability, not only is it reducing the interest of countries like India in getting any weapon systems from the Russians, because now they realize they're not all that, it's changing the complexion of what is possible. Because if you can basically in one spot bleed the entire Russian air defense grid, then you're not just talking about a change in the Ukraine war, you're talking about a change in what Russia is capable of. And we're still kind of coming to grips with what that means. This is also new. That is definitely the goal. Even if you don't conquer, reconquer, liberate, whatever word you want to use, Crimea, its military supply basically goes on two routes. There's a rail route that is on the mainland that goes through Mariupol, which is somewhat vulnerable to Ukrainian assault today. And that's the new line, that's the backup line. And then you've got the primary line, which is the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is becoming increasingly vulnerable. And I would argue that if the Ukrainians wanted to take that out today, they could, but they're waiting for more military capacity. And when you do that, Crimea goes from being a launch pad for Russian assaults to simply the most vulnerable part of the Russian landmass. And that's a different sort of complex. So this summer is going to get really interesting. Will the Ukrainians be able to pull this off? Everyone like me who saw this war coming, we all made predictions about how this was going to go, and we were all wrong. And then we got new data and we reassessed, and we were all wrong again. I'm just trying to highlight where we're seeing things move and where that might take us. The winter is going to be awful. It doesn't matter really what happens at this point. It's just a question of how much worse does it get. The Russians have basically taken something called the Fab 1500, dusted it off from the Cold War storage, put a Chinese-made flight kit on it, and have glide bombed it in and simply destroyed entire power plants. The Fab 1500 has roughly a metric ton of explosives in it, and it has a blast radius in excess of 3/4 of a kilometer. So you're not talking about sending an Iranian drone into a small transformer station, something that can be repaired in a few hours. You're talking about leaving a crater in the ground where a power generation asset used to be. And that's basically the entirety of southern and eastern Ukraine now. So there simply is not enough power. The only way that communities that are kind of east of Kiev and southeast of Kiev are going to have electricity this summer is if it's imported from the European Union. So it's a question now of transmission. Now, luckily, transmission is cheaper to put up than new generation, but yes, it's going to be a cold winter for all concerned.
So, let's break down the current state of Russia's control and what might happen next. Putin's rule relies on a mix of fear and deep surveillance, creating a seemingly stable but very fragile system. Historically, Russia has faced huge upheavals when things look unexpectedly fine, only for a dramatic loss or event to spark major changes. We're not quite there yet, but a significant setback, like a severe defeat in Crimea, could catalyze change. The real turning point here could be a dramatic change in how the conflict plays out. If Ukraine can break through Crimea's defenses and turn it into a dire situation for the Russians, it could force a reevaluation within Russia. Can you imagine if Crimea became a major disaster zone due to Ukrainian advances? Yes, starvation and destruction could lead to a significant change in public opinion and government stability. For now, Russia is still in a position where it can keep fighting due to its large number of soldiers, despite heavy losses and a declining population. But this isn't a short-term conflict. The longer Russia drags this out, the more pressure piles up. Their military tactics rely on long, drawn-out conflicts, which means losing ground could be catastrophic for them in the long run. Meanwhile, if Ukraine can gain air superiority, it could also turn the tide dramatically. The lack of air control is currently stalling Ukrainian advances. Still, if they gain a brief upper hand, they could clear mines, advance faster, and hit Russian positions more effectively. So, as we head into the summer, things will get intense. The situation could mark a crucial turning point, or extend into a prolonged struggle. And remember, even the best predictions have been off the mark so far, so keep that in mind as things unfold. What do you think of these developments? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and subscribe for more updates and analysis as we track this critical story.